Things. Good morning. I'm amazed at the giftedness that God has put together to enable us to be able to live stream what we're doing this morning. Just really quite amazed at all the talent and people that are working behind the scenes that you can't see. In January, we caught up with some dear friends from the past, Laurie and Jeanette. And growing up, Laurie was like my best mate. We did everything together. When I was growing up at Donald in the flat wheat country of the Wimmera Mallee there. And when friends get together that haven't seen each other for a while, we tend to tell stories, relive experiences from the past. And this night we were having a meal together, having a pizza together, and we started swapping stories. And I was sharing about a class, a maths class, and a school teacher that I didn't particularly like, and I don't think he was that fond of me. And I didn't like maths, but I liked reading these these Western, back in the 1800s, these shoot 'em up, gang fighting, blood and guts sort of stories. And I'd read these paperback Westerns, and I used to put the book just under my seat, under my desk, and so that the teacher couldn't see. Now, this maths class, I actually had done some work, but to be honest, not a lot, but I'd done some, and I was reading this little paperback Western, and I got caught. And this school teacher had this big blackboard ruler, and he just slams it down on the desk. He says, "Raymond, you haven't done a scrap of work this period." And something in me just rose up. There was this indignation because I had done something. I hadn't done a lot, but I'd done something. So something inside of me I stood up and I looked at him straight in the eye, and all the classes watching. I go, "Sir, that is an understatement." I meant to say it was an exaggeration. And in this moment when everyone was focused on me, I felt so embarrassed. And my mate Laurie, when we're reliving this story, he says to me, "Lex, you said that really, really loud." I didn't remember saying it really, really loud. I just felt the embarrassment. But he remembered a detail that I didn't. And so that's how the Bible has been put together. The narrative of Jesus' life in those first 4 books in the New Testament, they come from different angles, and different people remember detail differently, and it all adds to the full picture of what happened. And I want you to remember that as we do this little journey together this morning. But to start, I want to go back to a family that I knew in the past. They couldn't have children, so they adopted 2 boys. And that's a very noble thing to do. But the problem is that they seemed very clearly to love one much more than the other. The youngest could never do anything wrong. The oldest son was always being given a hard time. Always, there was no grace for him. It just looked from the outside that they didn't love them the same. The last time I saw the oldest son, he had been sleeping on our couch in our house in Sydney because he was now homeless. He was an ice addict. And I've seen that sort of loving one child more than the other play out in homes where the children are their natural children. And they prefer one, they love one much more than the other. And it's so clear, and it never goes well. And growing up, I was taught that God loves us all equally. And I found that really reassuring. It gave me a comfort and a confidence in who God is. But I'm not so sure that that's true. I don't see it the same anymore. I think it's like when we grow up, as we grow up, our bodies change. I actually had hair. At one time in my life, I had hair. That's long since gone. Our bodies change, but as we grow up, so does our ability to think and to reason and to understand and learn. And so I see that concept of God's love very differently now. In fact, I've come to realise that God doesn't love everyone the same. Now, just stay with me. I want to explain that this morning as we go along. Last week, we looked at the story of the empty tomb through John's eyes. And if you remember, John talked about this race that he and Peter had and how he beat Peter 3 times, he tells us, how he beat Peter. Because John's seeing it through his eyes, and he's describing a detail that no one else tells us in the story of the empty tomb. John's telling the story, so he's got the bragging rights to it. Now, Mark also records about the empty tomb, and he tells us through his eyes, and he records things that no one else has. And we're going to pick this up in Mark chapter 16, and it's where Mark is describing the women, and they're arriving at the tomb, and it's empty. Now, they didn't have a great plan. They just wanted to put these nice smelly things on Jesus' body, but they didn't know how they're going to get rid of the stone, how they'd even get access to Jesus' body. They just knew they had to do something. And what I love about God is that sometimes we don't have to have the best plans. We just have to know that we're going to do something, and we get started. And when they get there, they discover not only is the tomb empty, but there's an angel there, and the angel's saying to them, Jesus is alive. And he commissions them to do this. This is what the angel says. Go tell the disciples and Peter. He's going ahead of you into Galilee, and there you will see him just as he told you. Go tell the disciples and Peter. It doesn't make sense. Peter is a disciple. He's one of the top 3 in the leadership team. Like, why wouldn't the message say something like, go tell Peter, James and John and the rest of the disciples he's alive? But it doesn't say that. Why single Peter out? Why not John? Like, John was the only one that stayed at the cross when Jesus was dying. All the rest of the boys, they were scattered. They were in self-isolation. They were worried they'd catch what Jesus has caught. They were self-distancing from everyone. John stayed. And in those last moments on the cross, Jesus looked at John and he said, John, I want you to look after Mum. Mum, this is going to be your son. John, this is going to be your mum. And from that day on, John took Jesus' mum, Mary, to live in their family, to stay with them. So why not, if you're going to mention someone, mention John? Why? And Peter. I think it's because Jesus was sending a personal message to one of his devastated disciples. The dream that Jesus had sold Peter was over. It died on the cross with Jesus. And Peter's blown it. And it's all over. Go tell the disciples and Peter. Whatever you do, make sure Peter knows. Whoever you communicate, make sure Peter is not forgotten. Remember Peter. Take this to Peter. In fact, one of the translations says, tell the disciples and especially Peter. Peter, one moment, is walking on water. Next moment, he's cutting off the ear of a bloke. One moment, he's saying, Jesus, you're the man. You're the Son of the living God. The next moment, he's swearing and saying, I don't know him. Never heard of him. This is Peter. And at this moment in his life, he's wept bitterly. There's a darkness. He's been alone. And there's no way back for Peter. As far as Peter's concerned, it's all over. Now, without exception, every time Peter's name is mentioned in the New Testament, in the first 4 Gospels, without exception, he's always mentioned first. It's always Peter, James and John. And in Mark's account here, this is the first time ever that the disciples are mentioned and then Peter is spoken about last. And that's actually really important because the focus of the message is Peter. Dealing with others first just gets them out of the road so that Mark can highlight Peter. Because God doesn't treat and love everyone the same. There are times when God loves someone just that little bit extra because they need that little bit extra love. They could be emotionally drowning because the marriage is over, physically drowning because the diagnosis is not good, spiritually struggling because they've been hurt and disappointed by other Christians, let down by leadership, and wanting to withdraw. And Peter's in a bad place. Judas has already hung himself. Judas would not change the direction he was taking his life. Peter's not going to do that. But he's walked away from God. And whenever someone walks away from God, there's always someone goes with them. They take someone with them. It might be their children. People get hurt in church life and they withdraw. They're still okay with God, but their kids grow up distant. It might be friends, it might be family that's affected because our life always has an influence on someone else. No one gives up on God alone. And Peter says, I'm going fishing. I don't care what the Andrews government says, I'm going fishing. And 6 of the disciples go, can we come too? Please, can we come? It's what we do when we blow it. When we've messed up, we go back to our past life. We go back to what's familiar, what's comfortable, to old patterns, old habits. And when Peter gets this text message, tell the disciples and Peter, those last 2 words, Peter knew exactly what that meant. He didn't know if Jesus was alive, but when he got that text, he's going, if he's alive, he loves me. If he is alive, he cares for me. If he's alive, he's forgiven me. Those last words, they're little, they're small, but they communicate so much. It doesn't take much to show love. We had a little girl in our church here in Bairnsdale many years ago, and she was born with spina bifida, Jessica. And she would come to church in a wheelchair. And at that stage, I was the youth pastor. And being one of those really cool youth pastors, you got to wear a cap. And I would wear a cap to church. And after church, I would walk up to Jessica in a little wheelchair, and then I'd get down really low, and I'd put my little head down, and she'd grab my cap, and she'd throw it away. And then I would go and pick it up, and I'd bring it back, and I'd get back down again, and she'd grab it and throw it away. That little bit of extra attention told Jessica she was loved. And that took me to a moment in her life when she's 11 years old, and she's in the Bairnsdale Hospital. And it was a very precious moment in the family's life, and I felt very privileged to be there. And I was there when Jessica left this life to go into eternity. And I got to be with her when she died, because when she lived, she felt loved through a little act of a cap being thrown off my head. It doesn't take much for someone to feel loved, to feel cared for. There was a time in our life when we'd lost everything we owned, and I couldn't even find the money to buy food for our family. I don't know if you've ever been there, the financial pressure, it just crushes you. And I remember our senior pastor at the time, Bob Boots, and his wife Beryl came out, and they brought some cardboard boxes with some groceries for us. And as they were leaving, Bob puts his hand out to shake my hand. And folded up in his hand was $200 that he put into my hand. And I knew that it wasn't the church's money. I knew that it was Bob's money. It doesn't take much to feel cared for. And if you've ever been hurt by somebody, that's when the law of second response kicks in, where whatever you do in response to that hurt will determine the longevity, the future of this relationship. And sometimes it doesn't take much for a little act of something that will show that there's forgiveness, that you're not holding that against that person. It doesn't take much. It was just two little words, a message from Jesus and Peter. And it was enough for Peter to know that he was loved, that he was cared for, that he was forgiven. Remember, Peter has been in that race with John to the tomb. John believed when he saw the empty tomb, but Peter didn't. Peter still thought that Jesus' body had been stolen, and so this is where Peter is. This is where he's at emotionally, in his mind and his thinking, when this message arrives. Tell the disciples and Peter. Mark is the only one who records that detail. And Peter. Such a little thing. So insignificant, but not to Peter, because it helped to change the direction of his life. So do you know why Mark wrote that in his account of the life of Jesus? Because Mark based his whole narrative on the eyewitness account of, guess who? Yeah, Peter. If I had walked on water, I would make sure that if I was helping Mark write the story of Jesus' life and what happened with the disciples, I would make sure that my walking on water was in Mark's narrative for my grandkids to hear and read it, for my great-grandkids. But it's not there. The story of the storm and Jesus coming across the water, but when Peter was conveying to Mark what to write, he left out the bit about him walking on water. But he made sure Mark put in the two little words, and Peter. Those words are so precious to him. But Jesus didn't just stop there with that message to Peter. He did something quite extraordinary, because God doesn't love everyone the same. Who was the first disciple, male disciple, that Jesus appeared to? Yep, you guessed it, Peter. And Luke tells us that, and Paul tells us that, but we don't know what took place. It was private. There's no records. Peter's not talking about it, and God's not telling. And we all need moments in our life when we do business with God, and no one else needs to know. No one else has to be told. The fruit, the results of that comes out. We can see that in Peter's life, what happened as a response. But we all need those moments when we do private business with God, when Jesus comes to us and we talk to him and no one else is around. Have you ever wondered why the first person in all the world that Jesus chose to reveal himself to when he came back from the grave was a woman who had either struggled with severe mental health issues or had struggled with something like epilepsy that was caused by demon possession in her life, and Jesus healed her and set the 7 demons free? Have you ever wondered why, of all the disciples that Jesus chose, he chose Peter to privately go to before all the rest and reveal himself to Peter? It's because God doesn't love everyone the same. And I'm so glad that Jesus didn't go to John first, because John knew that he was loved. I'm so glad that Jesus found Peter, because Jesus was able to show Peter that he did love him, because Peter wasn't convinced about that. And I will be forever grateful that God doesn't love everyone the same, because I'm a recycled failure. I've walked away from what God has for me, for my life. I've done what Peter's done. And in my early 20s, we started up a youth ministry here in Bairnsdale, And it was really healthy, and it grew. We had about 80 kids there, and half were from unchurched families and half were from church families. In fact, Carissa and Glenda that are watching this right now, you were part of that youth group way back then. And you didn't have a church family. You didn't have church background. And this youth group was a significant part of people's lives, my life, the kids' lives. But then I got so busy building my own little empire with Angora goats that I walked away from what God had for me. And I got focused on doing my own things. And it wasn't till all of that fell in a heap, all of that was gone. And it was a very, very dark place in my life. And I'm now in my early 30s, mid-30s, and God gets hold of me. And he starts to encourage me, and I'm feeling so lost, and yet there's a moment in time like Peter, when Peter went into the darkness and cried bitterly. I can remember a moment when it hit me, when I had let God down, that I'd let a generation of young people down because the youth group now was gone. There were no kids left anymore. There were no kids in our church from that. They were just all gone and scattered, and the grief hit me, and I can remember sobbing like from the bottom of my stomach, just ugly tears. Everything was running, and it was just this emotionally draining expression of grief at what I'd done. And I think that was a turning point, because somewhere, like Jesus came and found Peter 3 nights in a row in early 1992, God recommissioned me back into youth ministry. I had let him down, let everyone down, but God came to me and inspired me, and we, in March the 20th, 1992, we started Solid Rock Youth Group, and we've had a significant influence in a generation of young people growing up in the years there, and I'm standing here today because God has taken me on a journey. And it began with him coming and showing that he still believed in me, that he hadn't given up when I'd given up on him. And I'm just so thankful that God doesn't love us all the same, that there's times when we all need just that little bit extra love. You will have a day when you need that. You may already have experienced that. I certainly have known it. But here's the point. No one misses out because God has this capacity to love with extra grace, extra love to us when we need it most. And he doesn't rob someone else to do that. He doesn't withhold love from someone else. He has the capacity to enlarge what we need. I want to read Jesus' words. And it's from Mark chapter 2. And this is the Good News translation. And Jesus says this: "People who are well do not need a doctor, but only those who are sick. I've not come to call respectable people, but outcasts. I've come for and Peter." In the Living Translation it says, "Healthy people don't need a doctor, sick people do. I've come to call not just those who think they're okay, who think they're righteous, but I've come for those who know they are messed up, who are broken, who are sinners." Of course, God has no favourites, but it doesn't mean he loves us all the same. There are times when we need that extra grace, extra love, to hear the words, "Go and tell the disciples," and in the text message, see our name mentioned there. God's rescue plan is for whosoever. Whosoever believes in him shall not perish. Whosoever follows me shall never walk in darkness. Whosoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. That's you. That's me. Let's pray. God, I thank you that your love has no bounds. In fact, your love has no limits, because you can enlarge the capacity to love us when we need it most. That you can find us in our deepest, ugliest moments in life, and you can rescue us if we will respond. And I thank you that you don't have favourites, but you don't love us all the same, because at times we desperately need that extra grace and extra love from you. And I thank you that you can do that. Thanks, guys. Over to you.